Welcome, everyone. As students in the class know, today is the third and final event on our schedule this semester, which is devoted to Israel, Palestine, and the associated unrest last year on college campuses. And I introduced the first event, the Interfaith Roundtable on January 21st, the day after inauguration. I noted then that we inhabit an illiberal age, and it's really hard to fathom how much worse things have gotten in 3 months. Today, universities are under siege by inimical forces in the federal government that equate any criticism of Israel and any criticism of American support for Israel as anti-Semitic. The casualties so far are research budgets, scholarly freedom, and institutional autonomy. And critically, foreign students and faculty members who participated in the protests against the war in Gaza or who publicly expressed their opposition to the war. Some of these foreign students and faculty members, legal residents of the United States, have been seized by ICE agents. Many more have had their visas revoked without explanation, often upon entry to the United States. The case of Rumeysa Öztürk, a doctoral student of Turkish citizenship at Tufts University, stands out. She remains in ICE detention. Her crime was writing an op-ed in the student newspaper at Tufts, criticizing official American silence about the war in Gaza. The State Department has admitted that she cannot credibly be accused of anti-Semitism. Now, the paradox is that anti-Semitism is real and it's on the rise, as we were reminded by the attempted murder by arson of the Jewish governor of Pennsylvania a few nights ago. But these anti-Semites, the ones who congregated in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, are useful allies to those same inimical forces that have been unleashed on universities. It's no secret that today's event has been the subject of a great deal of concern and controversy within the university community and beyond. Some of these concerns have been offered in good faith by longtime friends of the lecture series. I have tried to assuage these concerns as best I can by sharing my belief that there is no better place on campus to have difficult discussions about Israel and Palestine. But much of the criticism has not been offered in good faith. It is simply a means to intimidate and to silence. I am grateful that my university has not wavered on the core principle at stake here, which is the right of any professor to determine the content of his or her curriculum free from outside pressure. It is with that in mind that I am pleased to announce that today's talk is co-sponsored by the Academic Freedom Subcommittee of the University Senate. Okay, now I have the happy privilege to introduce our speaker to you, Ussama Makdisi. And Makdisi's credentials as a scholar are entirely non-controversial. Makdisi is professor of history and Chancellor's Chair of History at the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to his appointment at Berkeley, Makdisi was the first holder of the Arab American Educational Foundation Chair at Rice University. Makdisi is a scholar, among other things, of ecumenicalism in the Near East, which is one of the reasons I invited him. He is the author most recently of The Age of Coexistence, the Ecumenical Frame in the Making of the Arab World. That was published in 2019. His earlier books include The Artillery of Heaven, American Missionaries and the Failed Conversion of the Middle East. This book won numerous commendations, including the John Hope Franklin Prize from the American Historical Association. Now, I want to emphasize that this is the most prestigious award offered by my professional organization. So it would be impossible to offer in a brief introduction a full accounting of Makdisi's many commendations as scholar. But I want to highlight just two things. Makdisi has been fellow at both the American Academy in Berlin and the Wissenschaftskolleg. I note this with envy because I am an unsuccessful applicant for one of these. And also, Makdisi has a podcast on Palestinian politics and culture, which is called Makdisi Street, which I recommend to anyone who is inspired by today's talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Bittner, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to everyone here for showing up today for this lecture. And thank you as well for the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide for the invitation as well. I'm deeply grateful to each and every one of you, and especially to Professor Bittner for his and for the willingness of Sonoma State University to stand up for basic academic freedom. They remind us, of course, why universities are so important as spaces for critical thinking and for listening to viewpoints other than one's own. I have been teaching and writing as a scholar for not quite 30 years, coming up to 30 years. And as far as I can tell, never have I seen such attacks on universities in this country as we are experiencing today, nor have I experienced or witnessed, frankly, the levels of anti-Palestinian racism to be as manifest in this country as they have been today or over the past 18 months, to be honest. But also paradoxically, and I think many in this room, actually just thinking around this room, never has there been more demand to know more about Palestinian history and to deal and to think and to recognize Palestinian humanity. So there's a great paradox before us. I really thank again Professor Bittner and Sonoma State for the invitation. We are, of course, at a perilous crossroads in US history. Mahmoud Khalil, that Professor Bittner referred to, Rumeysa Ozturk languished in ICE detention centers in Louisiana after having been detained, kidnapped, really abducted for the crime essentially of peaceful dissent, for expressing in words and views solidarity with fellow human beings. Just yesterday, another peaceful Palestinian green card holder by the name of Mohsen Mahdawi was arrested by ICE in Vermont. Profoundly unconstitutional persecution of students, the chilling of free speech, the war on ideas of thought and dissent seeks to make the unthinkable routine. Soon enough, unless this immorality is stopped, the dragnet will inevitably widen to encompass and ensnare far more than the Palestinian Muslim students. One of the many lessons of the horrors of the Holocaust, in fact, as well as the lessons of other genocides in modern history, whether the Armenian genocide or that of the indigenous people of this continent, or that of the Herero people in Southwest Africa, or those in Rwanda, Bosnia, or Myanmar, is that depravity is always preceded by dehumanization, which is why, if I understand correctly, the mission of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide and its lecture series, it's imperative for each and every one of us to resist in any way we can, as academics, as scholars, as students, in other words, to resist peacefully, intellectually, ethically, morally, to resist the various mechanisms of dehumanization that have consistently paved the way for genocides in the past and, of course, in the present as well. My particular focus, inevitably, as Professor Bittner alluded to, is on the horror that has been unfolding in Gaza, relentlessly for the past 18 months. And its relationship to modern history, the modern history of Palestine, the modern history of the Middle East, and the modern history, of course, of Zionism itself. My basic fundamental humanistic conviction as a scholar, as a person, is that any person of any faith, of any remotely ethical political persuasion, has the capacity to learn from history, to see the world through more than one eye. But my conviction is also that one does not need to be a historian to be horrified by what has happened to the people of Gaza, the children of Gaza, the ongoing obliteration for 18 months of an entire society before our eyes, bomb after bomb, month after month, child after child, paid largely through and because of and with my tax dollars and many of your tax dollars as well. Like many others in this country and across the world, including some very notable Holocaust survivors such as Gabor Mate, I've been dismayed, I've been shattered, in fact, by my and by our collective inability to prevent the systematic, methodical, and cruel obliteration of humanity in Gaza, irrespective of one's actual politics. We're talking about people in the end. Just last week, Israeli forces bombed on Palm Sunday, no less, the Baptist hospital in Gaza. Again, the same hospital that they targeted at the beginning of the destruction of Gaza. For over 18 months, in fact, we have witnessed the most explicit, the most intense, the most relentless bombardment of a concentrated urban space in modern history. The fastest deliberate starvation of any population in recorded history. The greatest number of journalists killed in any conflict anywhere in the world. The greatest number of UN staff killed in any conflict since the beginning of the founding of the UN. The greatest number of child amputees in any modern war. The relentless targeting of doctors and teachers, of hospitals and shelters, of journalists, and of course, as a scholar, the destruction of every single university in Gaza. None of this is hidden. None of this is obscured by Israeli leaders who openly boast about their desire to ethnically cleanse Gaza. Now with the full backing, alas, of the Trump administration. Recall the awful recent AI-generated vision that was offered to the world of Trump's future Gaza emptied of Palestinians. The sheer cruelty of our moment has been matched by the impunity and hubris of those who play God as if history is not filled enough with the annals of other leaders in the past who vanquished what they consider to be lesser and inferior and dangerous peoples. We are not, however, living in the 19th century, when Western empires routinely proclaimed the supremacy of certain races over others, when they colonized, brutalized, and pacified non-Western peoples in the Americas, Africa, and in Asia at will. What then, and this is the question I want to address and think through with you, what then links the 19th century to our own era? Or more precisely, how to make sense of the Gaza genocide historically? Why is it that no major Western state, other than Spain and Ireland, let's say major Western states, but I consider Ireland to be a major Western state, Spain as well. Why is it that only Spain and Ireland have joined other non-Western countries in supporting South Africa's attempt to prevent the crime of genocide being committed in Gaza? Why across so many parts of the liberal West that so solemnly proclaim the universality of law and that enshrine and celebrate human rights? Why is it that people that in the same West, some peoples are valued more than others? More importantly, why is it and how is it that the alleged Western concern with combating anti-Semitism, real anti-Semitism, as Professor, there is of course real anti-Semitism in the world, but why is it that they're concerned with fighting anti-Semitism in official Western discourse coincides so clearly with an inherent Western lack of concern and a disavowal, in fact, of Palestinian humanity? Why should one be forced to choose between fighting anti-Semitism and supporting Palestinian humanity? These are the questions I'd like to address with you and think through. Why is being Palestinian, let alone studying, teaching, and protesting about their proliferation, so dangerous and out of bounds? Why, finally, is what is so obvious to the vast majority of the world, and I would say to a majority of the American public, why is it that the oppression of the Palestinians, why is this basic fact that is so densely archived and so densely studied, in fact, why is it out of bounds? Why is it so inscrutable? There's so many people in the West who think of themselves as moral, decent, and ethical people, because that is the most troubling aspect of all. In fact, it's not that there are racists out there who don't care about Palestinians. It's that people who are ethical, who are moral, who think, who are scholars, in fact, in many instances, have either been silent or have turned a blind eye to what has been happening in Gaza. The question that concerns me, in truth, is less to tell you that Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere, because there are Palestinians, of course, outside of Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, inside historic Palestine, in other words, inside the state of Israel, outside in the refugee camps, outside in the West and across the world. Why is it that Palestinians, so I'm not interested in telling you that Palestinians are routinely represented as dangerous, as shadowy, as terroristic, or as oriental. Edward Said, after all, pointed this out. The scholar Edward Said pointed this out decades ago in an important book called The Question of Palestine that he first published in 1979, a book to which I'll return to later in this lecture. But Said's more fundamental point is not simply that Palestinians have been orientalized, as being sort of represented as shadowy, as terroristic. The more important point that I'd like to elaborate with you this afternoon is why and how Palestinians have been systematically dehistoricized. In other words, rendered people without history. That's to say, how and why Palestinians, to say nothing about Arabs and Muslims more generally, are rendered peoples without an ethical or political importance. Peoples whose past and therefore whose present and future can be overridden by a deeply Eurocentric narrative that we can think of as a philo-Zionist narrative. The overriding is one that valorizes the imperatives of an ideology that emerged in Europe in the 19th century, the Zionist ideology, that cherished and celebrated the imperatives of trying to create a Jewish state. I'll get to that at the end of the day. But that has overlooked the obvious implications of what a Jewish state created in a multi-religious land called Palestine. What does it mean for all the non-Jewish people who live in this land? In other words, the Muslims and the Christians who lived and had been living in Palestine for centuries, let alone what does it mean for the Jews themselves, both in Palestine and in Israel and outside. The corollary to my inquiry today with you is also true. Rehistoricizing Palestinians, in other words, insisting that their history is important and has to be grappled with, has to be acknowledged, and has to be dealt with. Rehistoricizing Palestinians is a crucial aspect of reclaiming their humanity. This will not mitigate, of course, the catastrophic effects of the Gaza genocide, but it will contribute to undoing, as modestly as any of us can, the depravity that is surely going to scar each and every one of us for the rest of our life. Nobody who's witnessed, who's followed the Gaza genocide, is not going to be affected and scarred by this inhumanity. If I'm wildly optimistic, let me see at the end of this lecture, it may contribute, I'm hoping, that this inquiry will contribute peace in the long tapestry of justice that is going to be painstakingly stitched together by and through our collective efforts. Let us return now to some history and to the twilight of the Ottoman era, so the late 19th century, where I begin my story, when people of many different faiths, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and other peoples, coexisted in what was then known as the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, of course, for most of you who will know this, the Ottoman Empire was a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic state. And in the late Ottoman East, the Maghreb, the Arab East, people living in this multi-religious land, before the creation of Israel, before the creation of the Arab states, before the partition of this part of the world, people were grappling with what people around the world in the 19th century were grappling with, just to say, how do we build a modern future? How do we draw the line between piety and between politics? How do we separate Islam from the state? What does it mean? How do we act? What kind of furniture do we use? What kind of schools do we go to? And so on and so forth. In other words, they were sort of optimistic and they debated vigorously, both within communities and across communities and outside of communities, the nature of Ottoman modernity. But they had a faith in the future that was going to unfold. So in other words, people in the late 19th century in Palestine and in other parts of the Ottoman Arab East, as well as in the Ottoman Empire more broadly, people were not waiting for colonialism to unfold. Palestinian men and women in particular, like others in this region, lived, loved, quarreled, argued like other people in the region. And if there's any single point to bear in mind, it is this. Palestinians, or the people we refer to as Palestinians today, are like other people. They have all the things that all people have, the same dreams, the same desires, the same hopes. And so once you understand this, and once you accept this basic fact, which is so banal that I have to sit here and repeat it over and over again, once you accept this basic fact, you accept, then we can start telling the story, because they were, as I said, like the other peoples of this region, like Syrians, like Lebanese, like Jordanians, like Egyptians, like Iraqis, like Armenians, like all the other peoples of this region. Most were Muslim, of course. Others were Eastern or Sephardic or Arab Jews. Many were Christian of various Eastern Christian and more recent Protestant denominations. So I'm going to just move quickly to my great-grandfather, Shukri Musa, in fact, was one of these converts to Protestantism, Greek Catholicism. Shukri Musa, in fact, my great-grandfather, my maternal side, opened the very first Baptist church in Nazareth after a trip that took him from his native suburb in Palestine to Texas, to Waco, in fact. He returned to Palestine in 1910, and to his wife, who bore him a daughter, in 1914, my maternal grandmother, Hilda Musa Said, who is up there on the top right for you. Who bore her husband, William, was from Jerusalem, 5 children who survived into adulthood. Edward, as in Edward Said, was the eldest, followed by Rosemary, Jean, my mother, who was born in Jerusalem in 1940, Joyce, and Grace. Most people of Palestine did not travel nearly as far as my great-grandfather. Rather, they lived out their lives in an interconnected mashup that for centuries had linked Damascus, Sidon, Acre, Akka, in other words, Haifa, Beirut, Tripoli, Aleppo, Bethlehem, Jaffa, and Nablus and their hinterlands together. Like every other Palestinian man and woman, there was no need for my great-grandfather or his wife to explain the obviousness of their humanity or the naturalness of their attachment to their own land. As my mother always reminds me, and reminds our family, our history lies in our names. When my great-grandfather, however, was a young man of 26, there was a Jewish Zionist journalist in Vienna by the name of Theodor Herzl, who also dreamed. He published in 1896 a booklet called The Jewish State. Herzl himself set himself a difficult task. Herzl had never been to Palestine. He knew no Middle Eastern language, but he sought to convince his German language readers, Jews in Europe more broadly, and Christian European statesmen whose support he coveted, why a Jewish national state established in faraway Palestine, he also thought about Argentina, had to be done to combat European anti-Semitism. Herzl insisted that such a modern state would constitute what he called a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. The most remarkable aspect of Herzl's writing from our vantage point today is how unconcerned is not so much the Orientalism or the civilizational discourse or the racial discourse, but how unconcerned he was with the natives of Palestine, such as my great-grandfather, whose land he and the Zionist movement he led sought to acquire to build what was, in their view, a fantasy, an idea, a state, an exclusively Jewish state, and what had always been a multi-religious land. Herzl, to be sure, knew that there were native bodies in Palestine, and that these bodies constituted a problem for his fantasy of building a Jewish state. But he did not see Palestinians as people with significant history or humanity worth seriously considering, nor, to be sure, did the rest of the European Zionist movement that he headed, and nor did Western powers, colonial powers, including, of course, Great Britain in particular, who support the Zionist movement, lobbied for, argued for, pushed for, and eventually received in 1917 through the Balfour Declaration. None of these individuals, groups, or powers, with very few exceptions, saw Palestinians as people with actual, meaningful history. And that is important. Why? Because there has been a double standard that has consistently underlain Western philo-Zionism, in other words, Western support for the Zionist project in Palestine, from Herzl's time all the way to our own. Jewish and Israeli history and life are allegedly cherished as part, in the West I'm saying, as part of a putatively enlightened and civilized Western world. Muslim and Christian Palestinian history and life are fundamentally devalued. And this double standard has itself a long history. There were, of course, before Herzl, Protestant enthusiasts and theologians in Europe and North America who had long fantasized themselves about the idea of the return of Jews to biblical Palestine, but they had no interest in the actually existing diverse population of actual Palestine, including its Christian Palestinians. In the 19th century, the Zionist Jewish nationalist movement emerged in Eastern and Central Europe among European Ashkenazi Jews, such as the aforementioned Theodor Herzl. But it too at first largely ignored the native Palestinian population. Part of this fact, and this is the crucial aspect of the story, was geography. You need to remember that Zionism is many things, but Zionism was not born did not emerge among the indigenous Jewish communities of the East. It did not emerge from the Jewish communities of the Middle East. It did not emerge among the ancient Jewish communities, the indigenous communities of the East, but it did emerge in distant Europe. Its leaders were not Arab or Eastern or Sephardic Jews, but European Jews. Herzl, then Chaim Weizmann, then Ben Gurion, then Golda Meir, Menachem Begin, and so on and so forth. Its ethno-religious nationalist ideology was forged not by the pluralism of the Middle East or the late Ottoman Empire, but rather by the competing racial and ethnic and linguistic nationalisms of Europe. The racial anti-Semitism, in other words, the real racial anti-Semitism of the West, that was one of the main catalysts of the Zionist movement and of European Jewish nationalism, was alien to the rhythms of religious difference and coexistence, so familiar to the diverse inhabitants of the Ottoman Islamic East. Now, there's no need to romanticize the Ottoman Empire, but it is crucial to understand that Zionism emerges in Europe to respond to European problems, European questions, and above all, European anti-Semitism. Recall Herzl, that the Zionist project developed openly in the 19th century as a colonialist project, in an era when European empires routinely segregated humanity into a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. So while leading Zionists grappled with racial anti-Semitism in Europe, they were also desperate to belong to this Europe. They expressed, they shared, they contributed to, and they circulated many of the foundational racist tropes of 19th century Western culture. That the non-West, in other words, was manifestly inferior, including Eastern Jews as opposed to Western Jews. That the land of the indigenous peoples was largely, quote, empty and thus open to colonization. And that the removal of native peoples was justifiable and necessary in the interests of so-called civilization. Recall Herzl's statement that the Jewish national state he dreamed of would become, quote, a rampart of a portion of Europe against Asia. Recall as well that one of the most notorious slogans of the Zionist movement was, quote, a land without a people, or a people without a land. The underlying point here is that both Christian and Jewish versions of colonial Zionism were predicated on solving Europe's Jewish question, and that is, of course, the language of Europe itself, by removing or restoring Jews en masse to Palestine as if Palestinians did not exist or fundamentally did not matter. I think this is all crucial to understand. This obfuscation of Palestinian humanity and history became even more dangerous because when it moved from fantasy and an idea to an actual project on the ground, as Zionism moved from the ideas of Herzl to an actual project embraced and endorsed by the British government. So here we move to the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, for you here, described the Palestinians who, remember, in 1917 were the overwhelming vast majority of the population in Palestine, over 90% of the population, as merely non-Jewish communities who paled for Balfour and for the Zionists in historical, religious, and civilizational significance when compared to what Balfour and the Balfour Declaration explicitly identified as the more important Jewish people. So we have Jewish people on the one hand, we have non-Jewish communities, even though the vast majority of the population in Palestine in 1917 was Arab. The British mandate, not the Balfour Declaration, but the British state that gets created after World War I, the British mandate over post-Ottoman Palestine, established in 1920 and then formalized in 1922, privileged foreign European Jewish Zionists legally, administratively, and politically. Native Muslim and Christian Palestinian bodies, nevertheless, had a real and tangibly unwelcome presence. For the Zionists, who wanted to build, obviously, a Jewish state. The question they had to grapple with was how to build a Jewish state, given the reality of so many Palestinians on the ground. So unlike the distant academic Protestant clergymen obsessed with end times and with biblical prophecies, colonial Zionists were increasingly preoccupied by what they identified in the early 20th century as their more secular Arab question, that their own foreign European presence on the land invented. In other words, to solve Europe's Jewish question, the Zionists created an Arab question in Palestine, which of course is basically what to do with the Palestinians who live on their land, and how to build a Jewish state, given the fact that the vast majority of the population of Palestine was Arab. As soon as Zionism moved from Christian and Jewish Western colonial fantasy to Western colonial practice, Muslim and Christian Palestinians inevitably were seen. You could no longer obfuscate their presence. They were there on the ground. You had to deal with it. And they constituted, obviously, in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, a real impediment to the successful unfolding of the Zionist project in Palestine. Irrespective of whether one embraces the project or doesn't embrace the project, Palestinians were there. They were real. And Zionists saw them and talked about them. The more the Zionist state structure was put in place with British colonial support during the British Mandate of Palestine in 1920 and 1948, the more native anti-colonial resistance it generated. Native resistance in turn compelled Zionist colonists to grapple more seriously with what they described as their Arab problem. And the vast majority of this accepted Vladimir Jabotinsky, or Zev Jabotinsky, as he became known as, his thinking outlined in his famous essay from 1923 called The Iron Wall. So Jabotinsky basically said, of course they're there, Palestinians, the Arabs, of course they're native, of course they're going to resist their dispossession, but we believe in Zionism, and that is going to happen. They're going to be dispossessed, and the only way the Palestinians will ever accept, or the natives will ever accept our presence on this land is when they lose all hope of resisting our project. We have to build these at an iron wall, first with British bayonets, but then also with our own force, to impose, in other words, in essence, to impose the Zionist project on the indigenous population. Note that Jabotinsky, who was considered an extremist Zionist, did not deny the fact that there were natives on the land. Note that he didn't deny the fact that Palestinians were indigenous, or they were. He compares them to the Native American, the indigenous populations of this country. But he said that in the end, they had to lose hope in any form of resistance. It also compelled, in other words, the Zionist project as it unfolded with British colonial support against the wishes of the Palestinians and against the idea of self-determination that had come out of World War I. Against all these ideas, the British also realized that they had a problem in Palestine. They understood that the philo-Zionist mandate, the very structure of the mandate that privileged Zionism legally, administratively, politically in Palestine, and in terms of immigration, it totally supported the Zionist project. They realized that in the end, they had a problem because Palestinian resistance increased inevitably. First, there were petitions, then there were marches, then there was pleading, then there were riots, then there was an uprising. There was a whole range of Palestinian resistance to dispossession. And eventually in 1936, there was a massive anti-colonial uprising that took place that's known in Arabic as Al-Qudra, or the Great Uprising in Palestine. So in 1937, the British finally realized that there was no way to reconcile their support for Zionism, which was the official policy of the mandate, with the reality of Palestinian resistance. Something had to give. So they create a commission of inquiry. And by the way, I'll come back to this maybe in Q&A. There were some Jewish Zionists who realized how unethical it was to build a Zionist project in Palestine against the wishes and against the will and against the reality of the Palestinian native Arab presence. Hans Cohen, I'll come back to this later if we have time. But for now, just understand what was happening in 1937. In 1937, a year into the Great Strike or the Palestinian uprising against the British and against the Zionists, the British sent a commission of inquiry to find out, okay, what is actually going on in Palestine and what can we do? So in 1937, even though in 1937, again, the vast majority of the population, you have to understand, is still Palestinian, and the vast majority of land was owned by Palestinians, the British sent this fact-finding or this Peel Commission, an official British commission, led, of course, by the white men, as you can see on the top right, who were there to investigate and figure out how to resolve this problem. The 1937 Peel Commission recommended partition of Palestine. This was the first formal recommendation of partition. And it foreshadows, of course, the fateful 1947 UN partition plan that I'll come back to in a moment. Both plans, in other words, both the Peel Commission plan and the UN partition plan of 1947, prioritized the making of a Jewish state, not the creation of a secular democratic state. Both embraced as a central idea that the dispossessing of the native Palestinian majority of much of its land and its homes to make way for a Jewish state was both necessary and inevitable. The 1937 British partition plan, in fact, admitted plainly the injustice of what was going to happen to the Palestinians. Was remarkable because, of course, the British understood in 1937 that any partition plan in Palestine would mean that the Palestinians would have to give up their homes and their lands to make way for a Jewish state, because again, the Palestinians were the vast majority of the population, the vast majority of the land. And the Peel Commissioners didn't deny this. They said it openly in 1937. And they, well, you could argue disingenuous. The Peel Commission here, as you can see, this is the conclusion. You can read this report; it's widely available to you online. The Peel Commission plan sort of lauded the proverbial generosity of the Arabs to justify their role, quote, at some sacrifice, end quote, to themselves, into solving what the Commission referred to as the West's, quote, Jewish problem. In other words, we understand that there's no history of anti-Semitism in this part of the world. We understand that partition is what dispossessed the Palestinians. We understand that this is not fair, but Palestinians and Arabs are proverbially generous. Therefore, they're going to help us solve our problem, our Jewish problem at their expense. But they're a generous people. And I'm not even inventing this. You can go look this up yourself, go read the report and see for yourselves. Right away, this is 1937, this is written. Right away in 1938, a Palestinian historian by the name of George Antonius wrote his famous book called The Arab Awakening. And in it, and in this book, to make a long story short, in this book, George Antonius basically, it's a very long book. Again, it's available to each and every one of you on the Internet Archive. You can find it, it's freely available. He wrote that the treatment meted out to Jews in Germany and other, this is obviously after the Nazis have come to power, after the passing of the extraordinarily anti-Semitic racism of the Nazis. So Antonius wrote, he said, the treatment meted out to Jews in Germany and other European countries is a disgrace to its authors and to modern civilization. But posterity, he said, will not exonerate any country that fails to bear its proper share of sacrifices needed to alleviate Jewish suffering and distress. To place the brunt of the burden upon Arab Palestine is a miserable evasion of the duty that lies upon the whole of the civilized world. This also morally outrageous. In other words, Antonius in 1938, so obviously after the rise of the Nazis, after the extreme anti-Semitism of the Nazis has come to bear, Antonius is, of course, recognizing that there's a real problem in Europe that has to be solved. But his point is, the British are saying, you're going to solve at your expense our problems, our Western problems of anti-Semitism. And he said, and so there's no denial here whatsoever of anti-Semitism. It's the opposite. It's the exact opposite. It's a recognition of anti-Semitism, but also saying it's a European sort of, it's a European disgrace, the treatment that Germany and other European nations, how they're treating Jews. But the whole of the civilized world has a duty to combat this, not just dumping it all on Palestine by claiming that the Arabs are generous. Now, Antonius, of course, was not privy to the secret testimonies of the Peel Commission, this British commission that went to Palestine. He did not know what Winston Churchill said in 1937 in his secret testimony to the Peel Commissioners. This is what Winston Churchill said. So the Peel Commissioners publicly write this thing about Arab generosity. Privately, confidentially, here's what Churchill said. He says, I do not agree that a dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, the dog here being the Palestinians, of course, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the Black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wide race, to put it that has come in and taken their place. Straight out of 19th century racism, right there. Winston Churchill. So this is the flip side. There's the Peel's disingenuous arguments. Here's the more sort of explicit sort of rationale to dispossess the Palestinians. Nevertheless, despite Antonius' plea, because in the end, Antonius was just an intellectual. He wrote a book. Some people read it, most people ignored it. In the end of 1947, after the Holocaust, after World War II, after the catastrophes in Europe and around the world, the US politicians, and after the fact that US politicians rejected the survivors of the Holocaust, the mass immigration of survivors of the Holocaust into this country because of the racist immigration laws of this country. Just as Arthur Balfour himself, the author of the Balfour Declaration, had rejected Eastern European Jewish immigration to England. But these same US politicians in 1947 and 48, and the same journalists and intellectuals supported sending, or many of them at least, supported sending hundreds of thousands of Jewish displaced persons to Palestine in the name of decency and humanitarianism. Precisely as Antonius had feared, native Palestinians were entirely shut out of the decision-making process that directly affected them. In November 1947, the Western-dominated UN, this is before decolonization, so before Asia and Africa being decolonized, the Western-dominated UN voted to partition Palestine and establish a Jewish state, despite the fact, again, even as late as 1947, the vast majority of the population was Palestinian. And in this partition plan that you often hear about in 1947, the majority of the land was given to the minority, the Jewish minority. And the majority was given the minority of their land. Despite, again, centuries of Palestinian belonging on what had always been their land, their villages, their homes, their towns, their memories, all that was snuffed away in a single partition resolution in 1947. Not a single country from the region voted for this partition. You can see who voted for the partition, people who are far away. And so this is what happened in 1947. The Nakba, what Palestinians refer to as the calamity or catastrophe in 1948, what happened in 1948, what Israelis call the War of Independence, what Palestinians call the Nakba, was the destruction of Palestine. An entire society was destroyed. And hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were in fact expelled from their homes, from their lands. And in this way, the Zionist movement thought that it had resolved the Arab problem. In other words, Weitzman and others talked about the miraculous clearing of the land. The Zionists expelled over 900,000 Palestinians, or approximately 900,000. It doesn't matter. Some people say 800, 900,000 Palestinians to neighboring lands and expropriated. This is the crucial part. Their homes, their lands, their books, their property, their archives. More to the point, they didn't let these people back at home. My mother's relatives lost their home in Jerusalem. This was the moment when what we today call the Gaza Strip, that you've heard so much about, was created. There was no such thing as the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip itself reflects the mangled geography of what became a historic Palestine. And the interesting thing again here in this connection is that liberal Western states and leaders hailed the creation of an ethno-religious nationalist state in a historically multi-religious land. Remember that leading American liberal figures, such as the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr and the co-author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, rationalized and justified the displacement and the uprooting of the Palestinians. They did so not in the Trumpian way of just they don't matter as such, they don't count, they're vermin. They didn't say that. They just said that there's a more important cause. And in fact, if anything, they blamed the Palestinians for opposing their own displacement. Eleanor Roosevelt justified her support for colonial Zionism by dehistoricizing. Again, this is so crucial. Dehistoricizing what she considered to be primitive, irrational, and aggressive Arabs. That they were not being reasonable in opposing their own displacement. So World War II, the creation of Israel in 1948, reflected, in short, something quite profound. It's not just, and I think this is one of the crucial points we're trying to get across, it's not just Western colonial attitudes towards the non-Western world. That's clearly part of a fundamental part of what's happening. It's also the fact that support for Israel, the creation of Israel after the Holocaust, the identification with Israel reflected something, I think, more profound in the sense that it reflected a reconstitution of a Western post-war humanism, a humanism reborn in Philo-Zionist core. My former colleague at Rice University, a historian, quite brilliant historian by the name of Daniel Cohen, has a book coming out called Philo-Semitism in Europe Since the Holocaust. In this book, Cohen shows in painstaking detail how in the wake of World War II, European philosophical, religious, and moral rehabilitation of man, white Western man, of course, was predicated on a recognition of the history of anti-Semitism that culminated with the rise of evil Nazism. The creation of Israel as a Jewish state, therefore, represented an implied, Owen argues, an implied Western atonement for its own terrible Western anti-Semitic past. Israel received reparations from Germany in 1953. In this philo-Zionist turn, the Jewish victims of Nazi genocide, the horrors of Nazi racism, the Holocaust, were transformed into an allegory of the modern West fighting for freedom. And by virtue of the Eurocentrism at the heart of Western historiography and philosophy, the modern world fighting against totalitarianism. In other words, the war against Nazi racism, and specifically the repudiation of Nazism's repugnant and virulent anti-Jewish ideology, was made central to a reconstitution, if I understand Daniel Cohen's book correctly, was made central to a reconstitution of what it meant to be moral and liberal in the post-war West. In other words, there's been a long history of anti-Semitism that hasn't been reckoned with. We need to reckon with this anti-Semitism. Israel is the atonement and the sign of the expiation of this horrific anti-Semitic past. Palestinians, however, did not figure, nor did the rest of the colonized world. It is not a coincidence that the great Black anti-colonial poet and writer Aimé Césaire castigated this post-World War II Western conception of the rights of man as, quote, pseudo-humanism. At exactly this moment, in 1955, when he wrote a book called The Discourse on Colonialism, Césaire was not writing about the Palestinians specifically, but more broadly about the Arabs in Algeria, the Blacks in South Africa and Madagascar and the Caribbean, the Vietnamese and other indigenous peoples around the world. Césaire noted how this Western pseudo-humanism was based on what he called a, quote, narrow and fragmentary, and he also said a sordidly racist conception of the rights of man. Césaire was disgusted by how post-war European states and societies were willing to finally condemn Hitler and anti-Semitism, not because one shouldn't, because his whole point, of course you should condemn those things, but refused, he said, to abandon most of their colonial possessions without a bitter and sustained fight. Instead, Césaire notes, by splitting the fight for a continuation of Césaire thinking, by splitting the fight against racism and colonialism more broadly from the fight against anti-Semitism, Césaire anticipated something that is deeply problematic and continues to be evident. In other words, how the West, after the Holocaust and after World War II, could now love the largely absent Jews of Europe and the West, and love them instead in their new and in the eyes of Western philo-Zionists, proper national home in Israel. Again, Palestinians, exactly. There's no Palestinians in this moral category. So anti-Semitism, atonement, and then the Palestinians are simply a footnote into this history. The Western denial of an ancient, sustained, and meaningful Palestinian relationship to Palestine has had profound, corrosive, moral, political, and ethical effects. It has led to a set of dogmas that continue to shape how current events, including the genocide in Gaza, are interpreted across the mainstream West or denied. The most important of these dogmas is not to question the implications of what Israel as a Jewish state means for the native Palestinian Muslims and Christians who are not Jews, of course. The survivors of the Nakba, who remain until now condemned to be at best precarious second-class citizens of a state that explicitly says is not a state for them. Recall the nation-state law of 2018 in Israel. Recall that Palestinian survivors of the Nakba today constitute 20% roughly of Israel's current population. Not talking about the West Bank, not talking about the Gaza Strip, not talking about East Jerusalem, just inside Israel itself. Nearly 5 million other Palestinians live in various humiliating forms of and degrees of unfreedom as either stateless non-citizens under what major human rights organizations, B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Al-Haq, describe as apartheid in occupied East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and of course, in the brutalized Gaza Strip. And still millions of other Palestinians remain in exile, unable to return to their homes, simply because they are not Jewish. Yet to question the professed Jewishness of the state, despite this overt discrimination that the state practices towards its non-Jewish subjects and citizens, remains largely unthinkable across the official West. For to question colonial Zionism in the West is tantamount to questioning the sincerity and the implications of the West's alleged turn on its own anti-Semitic past. In other words, the West is saying, we are no longer anti-Semitic, we support Israel. Forget the Palestinians for a second. And at the same time, so if you question that, it's as if you're questioning the sincerity of the West's turn on its own anti-Semitic past. The second Palestinian dogma that shapes the contours of post-war Western humanism is to regard Israel very much as an extension of an idealized West. Israel, of course, had classical and still has classical music, European institutions, a modern army, pioneers, communal producers, and above all, who was thought of in the 1950s as a young nation that contrasted with the background images of squalid, nameless Arab refugees. Israel was what the West wanted and needed after World War II, an emancipated part of itself, allegedly purged of a historical and deep anti-Semitism. In the 1950s, therefore, Western liberals and leftists, not the conservatives, are the ones who overwhelmingly enthusiastically supported Israel as a Jewish state, despite its treatment of a largely invisibilized Palestinian. This included trade unions, this included liberal theologians, I more refer to radicals, socialists, and liberals. Jean-Paul Sartre from the West and others. There are so many other people who supported Israel as a state. The third dogma was to make actual Palestinians unrelated to Western humanism, except as a negative value, as Edward Said pointed out decades ago, and to represent Palestinians as either sullen, dehistoricized refugees or equally dehistoricized, enraged, violent people who violate the very core of post-war Western humanism because they oppose colonial Zionism. So in other words, Palestinians have been stripped of confidence, they've been stripped of history, they've been stripped of lived experience. Palestinians are only made as beings who cannot love, they can only hate. Palestinians, in other words, are cast outside of history. They appear to return in the West and in Western consciousness only to threaten what in the West is considered to be, as I said, the atonement for the West's anti-Semitic past. So every time the Palestinians act, they don't act as Palestinians. They're represented as anti-Semites. Act to violate the history that the West has created of itself for World War II. After 1948, in any case, the Zionist movement coalesced around the state of Israel. This is very weird. Anyways, let's go. Okay. After 1948, in any case, the Zionist movement coalesced around the new state of Israel and steadily invested in building a remarkably positive, emotional relationship to Israel. In addition, as Israeli historian Ilan Pape has recently written, the Zionist movement built up an impressive and undeniable lobbying presence in every major Western state, especially the United States. This was reinforced by a campaign of memorialization of the Holocaust across the liberal West after 1967. In other words, after Israel colonized the rest of historic Palestine, including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. The flip side of the memorialization of the horror of the Nazi genocide, and there are, of course, across the West, some incredibly important museums and incredibly important memorializations of the Holocaust and of Nazi sort of racism and of other forms of genocide. But the flip side is the illusion, the constant illusion of the hugely consequential fact that George Antonius foreshadowed in 1938 that Palestinians collectively have been made to pay the heaviest price in post-1948 world for the creation of a Jewish state on their lands, despite the fact that they had no history in Western-style anti-Semitism. This then brings us to where we are today. Because again, whether it's in October 7th, after October 7th, before October 7th, there's this consistent denial of Palestinian humanity and history, and therefore an inability to understand and think of Palestinians as people. And I could go on and on and on, but I want to sort of end because where we are today, and I can talk about the Gaza genocide in the Q&A, but where we are today is at an incredible crossroads, as I began. Because despite the fact that the state of Israel has increasingly shed its liberal image and increasingly escalated its more sort of overtly racist treatment of Palestinians and the discourse, including the nation state law of 2018, but Ben Gvir and many others, Netanyahu, and the things they say about Palestinians as settlers and what they march and how they march in Jerusalem, chanting death to the Arabs, etc., etc., etc. The pogroms in the West Bank, the Gaza, all that is happening, has been happening for a while. All the more reason to interrogate the still potent yet diminishing official Western subscription to many of the narrative that I've tried to lay out, the narrative of the history of the 20th century, the narrative of the history of the 19th century, at the base of which, when it comes to Palestine, is a denial of Palestinian history and humanity. So after 1948, of course, the Palestinians were expelled, not just from their land, but from history, in a sense. It became, as Hassan Kanafani says, men of the sun. They became wards of the UN-supervised welfare system known as UNRWA, which is, of course, relief works agency, not dealing with Palestinian political rights. And so, even though there was some anti-third world solidarity with the Palestinians beginning in the 1960s and in the 1970s, in the West, there was precious little solidarity with the Palestinians. And so when Palestinians would try to mobilize in the West, whether it was through peaceful means or when Palestinians in Palestine employed violent means, they were castigated in both instances as being anti-Semitic. And this sort of demonization of all forms of Palestinian resistance, including, by the way, peaceful forms of Palestinian resistance, as essentially evil terrorism, in fact, builds on centuries-old genealogy of how Western powers have depicted and viewed anti-colonial, third world, indigenous resistance and slave revolts in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The difference with the Palestinians is they're not just cast as evil and barbaric, they're also cast as anti-Semitic, precisely because of this history that I've tried to outline. And so we've got now to where we are today. I'd like to end here with this extraordinary world that we're living in, where if you talk about Palestinian history and you uphold Palestinian humanity, and you insist on equal rights and equality for all people in historic Palestine, in Israel, and in the Palestinian territories, and you say you're for equality, you're considered anti-Semitic. And if you do the opposite, you're considered something else. And the chilling conclusion of this conversion is real for all of us to see. What did the ADL do when Elon Musk raised his hand in what was an apparent Nazi salute? I don't know what it was, but it was clearly a salute for some time. It said, quote, it was an awkward gesture in a moment of enthusiasm. Notice as well how Donald Trump has used the word Palestinian as a slur, not once, but repeatedly. Recently claiming that Chuck Schumer was, quote, no longer Jewish, and instead has become, quote, a Palestinian. Schumer did not reply. The other conclusion is evident in the extraordinary persecution of Mahmoud Khalil, of Rumeysa Öztürk, and others, and the unprecedented authoritarian crackdown on academic freedom, on basic constitutional values, and even on the basic functioning of American universities. The persecution does not come out of the blue. It comes out of a history of the past 2 years, but it also comes out of a much older history that goes back all the way to the beginnings of this story, when Palestinians and their history were denied. And so at the end, the question really is, and Edward Said, this is where I'm ending now, going back to the question of Palestine, the book that he wrote in 1979, the question really is how then to think about a future, even though it's very difficult for me to think of a future in the middle of a genocide, but how to think of a future and a relationship between Palestinians and Israelis and of course the West is utterly implicated in this future. How to think of a future in more humane terms. Edward Said was one of the first, if I'm not mistaken, who talked about the Palestinians being the victims of the victims. In other words, he recognized the history of Holocaust, the history of anti-Semitism, but said that the Palestinians were made to pay the price. Again, they don't deserve, he wrote, that to pay the price for West's expiation of Western sins against the Jews. And he said against the Jewish victims of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And he said for people not to recognize that Palestinians do not deserve its price is, he said, an act of complicity and moral cowardice of a singular dimension. So the point that Said made 3 decades ago still stands today. The Gaza genocide is our crucible. For unlike the Nakba of 1948, when the West elided Palestinian suffering, delighted the traumatized bodies of Palestinians. Today, these bodies are in full view. Everybody knows what is happening in Gaza. It is not a secret. It is open. Everyone can see this. And what we have instead is something profoundly immoral happening before our eyes. The genocide is being justified, and at the same time, it's being denied. The question for each of us to make today is on which side of history we want to stand. Are we for real justice? Are we for real freedom? Are we for real equality, real ecumenism, or are we not? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So as you know, the tradition in this class is that the right of the first question or questions belongs to students who are enrolled in the course. Don't be shy. Yeah, Ella, stand up and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Ella. You mentioned at the very end this idea of victims of victims. So I was wondering if you could maybe touch more on that and the idea of intergenerational trauma, both as far as sort of on both sides, what's happening.
Yes, okay. I can thank you for the question. I mean, let me quote you Edward Said's full quotation, but I urge you to go read the book, Question of Palestine, widely available on an illegal Russian website. No, widely available. You via your libraries and other fine places where you can buy books. Sure. Edward Said wrote the following. He said, "Here then is another." This is 1979. Here then, or 1992 in the preface to the second edition. Here then is another complex irony. He said, "How the classical victims of years of anti-Semitic persecution on the Holocaust have in their new nation become the victimizers of another people, or become therefore the victims of the victims." And then he goes on to say, "Surely if no one can come forth and say frankly, yes, Palestinians do deserve to expiate the historical crimes committed against the Jews in Europe, it must also be true that not to say no, the Palestinians must not be allowed to go through these ordeals any longer is an act of complicity and moral cowardice of a singular dimension." So that he wrote this in 1992. Today we're in a vastly worse situation. So in terms of the question about intergenerational trauma, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't speak to that. I'm sure there are psychologists, but just think about what's happening right now. Think about what's happening to millions of Palestinians, especially the children in Gaza, who are the majority of the population in Gaza, who are going to, insofar as they survive, are going to be carrying this trauma for yet, for God knows how long. Until there is a solution, until there is a way of conceiving of a future that is actually about equality, that is actually about sort of a common future, a future where both people can live, or two people, I mean, if there's not such, the trauma will continue. But the idea of resolving trauma at the expense of others, which has been the Western approach to dealing with anti-Semitism, then of course the Palestinians are going to continue to suffer, continue to have intergenerational trauma. And I don't know about so that's my answer. Of course, there are others who will answer differently. But again, I remind you that there are many Holocaust survivors, actual Holocaust survivors, who today, those who are quite elderly today, including, I mentioned Gabor Mate and others, who are horrified at what's happened. Because the point is not to pit people against each other and not to pit victimization against each other, but to figure out a way forward. But the only way to do that is if you're honest about the history.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Julia. I was curious. There were a lot of parallels that you mentioned with other instances of colonization history, specifically the Indigenous Americans, and Churchill's quote, the Indigenous Australians. Was there a sense by these kind of earliest Zionist thinkers that that their ideas were really in line with this kind of colonialism, or was it so much a part of kind of the intellectual zeitgeist of the times that they didn't really understand the implications of what they're saying, or were the implications kind of the whole point?
I mean, both, I think. Yes, the answer, I can go back. Screen on. I can go into it. Okay, there you go. Okay. So if I go here to answer your question, with Hans Kohn, I told you I would come back to it.
Yeah.
But the answer is, just to answer the question as briefly as I can, if I understood the question correctly, the answer to the question is in the 19th century, the Zionist movement didn't deny the fact that it was a colonized movement. Because that was in fact the lecture zeitgeist. So I won't call it the internet, because of course, from other parts of the world, there were other forms of thinking, other ways of thinking about the collectivity of the world. But the Europeans and the Americans in the 19th century, as you know perfectly well, were completely convinced of the supremacy of certain races and nations over others. And so the idea that what's interesting about the Zionists is that they never pretended to be anything other than a product of this 19th century European world. The difference is that they were confronting anti-Semitism, which is all about saying that Jews don't belong in various European nations. Therefore, they wanted to solve this problem, and the way they solved it is through European means. So, to make a very long story short, a European problem, anti-Semitism, a Western problem, anti-Semitism, in the racial sense, where people actually call themselves anti-Semites. They were actual anti-Semites who were virulently anti-Jewish and were completely opposed to Jews and Jewish emancipation and Jewish presence in Europe. In response to that, you have the Zionists who want to create a Jewish state outside of Europe. And of course, as I began with Herzl, it's not just Herzl, we can go read any number of Zionists. They were completely committed to the idea of colonizing Palestine. They didn't deny that. They didn't call themselves a national liberation movement until much, much later, well into the 50s and 1960s. However, there were Zionists like Hans Kohn, who like Theodor Herzl was from Vienna, was a Zionist, went to Palestine as a Zionist settler, as a colonist. He went there. And he, in 1929, after a Palestinian uprising in which innocent Jews were killed, he wrote the following. He said, and these are his words, his point was, he says, the reality of divine, it's a very long paragraph. I know that I'm not supposed to give you guys long paragraphs, but it's complicated. But the bottom line of what Hans Kohn said in this letter, where he resigns from the Zionist movement, he says, look, we came here, there are Arabs, there are Palestinians, there are Arabs, you can call them Arabs. And he said, the Arab question, how we deal with the Arab question is how we judge the efficacy and the ethics of this movement. And given the fact that we've been here for a decade at this point, and we pretend that the Palestinians simply don't matter, and we turn our backs on them, that it is, for him, a damning sort of indictment of the Zionist movement. He goes on to say, and not because he cares about Palestinians per se, but because he cares about Judaism. That was his argument. He says, quote, we pretend to be innocent victims. Of course, the Arabs attacked us in August 1929. Since they have no armies, they could not obey the rules of war. They perpetrated all the barbaric acts that are characteristic of colonial revolt. But we are obliged to look into the deeper cause of this revolt. We had been in Palestine for 12 years without having even once made a serious attempt at seeking through negotiations the consent of the indigenous people. Again, notice, there was no denial back then that the Palestinians were the indigenous people. We have been relying exclusively upon Great Britain's military might. We have set ourselves goals which by their very nature have to lead to a conflict with the Arabs. We ought to have recognized that these goals would be the just cause of a national uprising against us. But for 12 years, we pretended that the Arabs did not exist, and we're glad when we were not reminded of their existence.
Oh.
So in other words, and the reason why Hans Kohn is important is because, of course, he was Jewish, he was a Zionist, who gave up Zionism, and he made the distinction that many people, of course, made between Judaism and Zionism. As opposed to Jabotinsky, who was his contemporary, who had the opposite reading. In other words, Jabotinsky said, yes, there are indigenous people. Yes, they are opposing us, but we have to dominate them through the Irish wall. You see what I'm saying? So when you talk about zeitgeist, it's important to understand, yes, there is Western racism in broad terms, But there are always individuals and people who fight against this. Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and many other cases. Right?
Yeah, so the students have asked questions, so I'm happy to take broader questions. Yeah, so Roy Pat, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. Well, first of all, Professor, thank you for being here. My name is Daniel. Before I get to my question, I think just for context, I think we have some similarities in with the fact that I come from a Palestinian Christian family. My mother was born in Jerusalem in 1947. My younger brother was born there. I want to, I guess, speak about, in this kind of, it feels like a microcosm of what's going on with, just some of the negative attention about having this here. So thank you for allowing this to happen at Sonoma State. And the whole thing with the and I thank you for the context that you provided. Is I read in a piece by a Cal State Long Beach professor who's a expert in Middle Eastern politics and specifically covered Palestine for many years, is that in pre-World War II era in Jerusalem, Mizrahim, in other words, Arab Jews, were maybe 30% of the Jewish population in the 20s or 30s. Yet it took until maybe the 1980s or so for Mizrahim to be considered for cabinet positions and things like that. So the piece, which I highly recommend, is, I think it's something, it's titled "The Identity Crisis of Palestinian Jews." So I guess if there's a question here, it's maybe more for kind of your comments on the fact, because obviously you don't have time to talk about 100 years of history in this 1 hour session, but I think that just kind of speak volumes as far as the fact of, a lot of folks want to make this a religious war and about religion, but I think the greatest, some of the biggest takeaways to your point is that Palestine was a land of multicultural, multi-religious, and you didn't really have time to address it there, but would love to hear your comments on.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. Of course, it's not just Palestine; it's also Syria, Lebanon, all the region that I'm talking about: Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Egypt. This whole region was multi-religious. It's really important to understand this. It is so crucial to understand this point. And also, I would highly recommend you read a book by an excellent Israeli historian by the name of Avi Shlaim, who wrote a book, just a memoir recently, called Three Worlds, in which he talks about sort of recovering. He was from Iraq, an Iraqi Jewish, Arab, he called himself an Arab Jew from Iraq, who was a kid who went to Israel after 1948. And talks about how he grew up sort of like being ashamed of his Arab culture. Only then, to become a famous Israeli historian, only then at a much older age to recover and to sort of piece together his history of his family in Iraq. And of course, the point is, and in fact, we just had him on the podcast this morning. In fact, it's coming out next week. But the point is to emphasize the two things. One is that coexistence was and has been a profound aspect and part of the history of the modern of the Middle East. That is undeniable. And especially Muslim, Christian, and Jewish coexistence. Now, as a historian of coexistence, I immediately say two things. That doesn't mean coexistence is the same as equality. Because of course, coexistence varies depending on place, space, location, and so on. But the more important point is that Jews were not singled out as the minority in this part of the world, unlike in Europe. It's really important to understand this. In the great massacres of the 19th century, were, of course, of Christians in places like Damascus in 1860, which were incidental. I mean, I don't want to say it because, again, there's a whole history of coexistence, and there are punctures in coexistence. But 1860, there was a massacre of Christians that I've written about. You've had, of course, I know you've had speakers talking about the Armenian genocide, which occurs at the very end of the Ottoman Empire. So it's important to understand that Muslims and Christians and Jews had and shared an extraordinary history. And where it's not for Zionism in parts of the world, there is no question that when I say a Jewish Arab or an Arab Jew, it wouldn't startle people in the way that it does. Although today you can say Christian Arab, nobody bats an eyelid. You can say Muslim Arab, nobody bats an eyelid. Why is that when we say Jewish Arab, people say, wait, hang on, that's complicated. It shouldn't be. It's part of our history. And it's part of a beautiful part of our history that's been completely and utterly denied and sort of erased. And we need to recover this history.
Yes, thank you. And
I am Fred, and I've been into Palestine and saw IDF shooting some boys, killing because they were throwing rocks at them. East Jerusalem in 1970. But my question is, what was life like for the Palestinians between 1950 and 1967, that 17-year period, both in the East Bank and also in the Gaza Strip for the Palestinian people at that 17-year period?
I could refer you to some books. There's tons of studies and tons of books and tons of memoirs. Are you talking about inside Israel itself? Are we talking like most, of course, Palestinians, even the citizens who became citizens? And there's a book by Shira Robinson that I highly recommend you read, called Citizen Strangers. You could look and see about the history of Palestinian citizens of Israel who were, of course, under martial law between, from the Nakba all the way to 1966. Then, of course, you have Palestinians who were expelled or who lived in the West Bank, because many of the refugees from inside what became Israel ended up in the West Bank. Many from around the Gaza Strip ended up in the Gaza Strip itself. And in those two areas, you had an Egyptian administration in Gaza, and of course, you had the Jordanian annexation of the West Bank after 1948. That ends in 1967 when Israel, of course, occupies the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. But again, there are many books I could refer you to, and articles and so on. So, yeah,
Melissa.
I'm Melissa, I'm a student here. Do you believe, or is it possible that the Gaza genocide could lead to World War III?
I want the Gaza genocide. I hope everyone in this room agrees. I want it to end more than anything else. I want the killing to end. Honestly, that's what I want. That's what everybody that I know who is an ethical person wants. Who knows what's going to happen? I don't know what's going to happen. It's just, to me, it's unfathomable that people are still being slaughtered in the way that they are. And this is the first live-stream genocide that I'm aware of. It's extraordinary to see all this brutality happening, and none of us are able to stop it. What it's going to do, I don't know, but it certainly needed and has led to expose an extraordinary corrosion in the official political West, which has done almost nothing to stop the genocide, and has in fact enabled Israel by sending out weapons and supplies and fighting against the International Court of Justice, the South Africa case, to prevent genocide. Because the whole point of the Genocide Convention is not just to mourn the genocide after the fact, it's to prevent the genocide. And that's where we are. So what's going to happen, I don't know. I'm better about talking to the past. But I hope to God, as everyone does, that this horror ends.
The back row there.
Thank you. Is it really true that there's nothing we can do to make this stop? I'm looking at the recent Pew Research, and the position of the country has changed dramatically. And it seems like we are at a terrifying turning point, but really, is there nothing we can do? Is there no general strike? Is there no tax protest, anything?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. I really don't. You're probably just as equipped as I am to answer that question. It's not that there's nothing. I mean, everyone does what they can do. I speak out, you speak, everyone's doing it. The students, after all, are students of all faiths. It was Jewish students also were protesting against the genocide. We have to remember this. So were Muslim students, so were Christian students, so were Hindu students, so were Buddhists, so were any number of students who were protesting against this genocide. Atheists, all sorts of people were protesting against it. People have been protesting and speaking out, and they've been slammed, they've been defamed, they've been accused of the most awful things. What is their crime? Their crime is saying the genocide must stop and end. So people do what they can do, but in the end, the reality is that even the Pew poll you're referring to, it hasn't stopped U.S. policy. It's the policy, both in the Biden administration that enabled this, and now the Trump administration that continues this. And so, yeah, people should do whatever they can, but in the end, each of us has to face our own ethical sort of, morality in ending this hard, whatever we can do.
Yellow Patagonia, sure. Please introduce yourself.
So I'm Palestinian by my mother's side, and when I came to this country from Beirut, where a lot of Palestinians are born, I was struck by the term anti-Semitism. It took me aback. I said, there's anti-Jewish racism, which is an awful thing, which we call it now. There's anti-Palestinian racism, which is doing awful things to people in Gaza as we speak, and allowing it to happen. And then anti-Semitism, I'm a Semite too. And so I challenge everyone in this room, and I'm certainly grateful for your perspective and your but you understand I'm not to put you on the spot, but what do you think about that? We can go on the offensive, because what's most atrocious about it is that it's a genocide being carried out physically on the ground and in the air by one sibling against another genetic sibling.
Yeah, but it's not about, thank you for the question. I think it's not about like siblings or not siblings. It's about, in the end, all genocides in history, are committed. People commit these genocides in history, whether it's the 19th century or the 20th century, where we are today, the 21st century. There's hubris, there's arrogance, there's misinformation, there's racism, there's denial, there's all sorts of things that go on in these things. But don't get too hung up on the anti-Semitism, the question of who's a Semite, who's not a Semite. I think it's anti-Jewish racism, what it is. And it comes, and the whole point of anti-Semitism is that it emerged in Europe in response to, European Christians mostly, and those and nationalists who refused the idea of Jewish emancipation, refused that there should be a Jewish place in a national belonging. That was the whole point of those racists in the 19th century. And then Zionism emerges in Europe in response to that, in a dialectic with that, and then decides to use European needs in the Long West. And generates, as I said, the Arab question to resolve the Jewish question of Europe. And here we are today, 100 years later plus. And we're dealing with the legacies of what we can very clearly see is not a religious conflict. If this were a religious conflict, you would have had this conflict for centuries. It hasn't been. You can very specifically and concretely, as a historian, date the beginnings of this so-called Arab-Israeli conflict. You can date it very specifically. You can either say 1897, the Basel Congress, where Palestine is selected as the place where they're going to create a Jewish state, or you could say the Balfour Declaration of 1917, or you could say Herzl Jewish, whatever you want. You can date it very specifically, but there's no history of Arab-Jewish so-called conflict as such in the way that people imagine. That is a way of people avoiding talking about the very recent history. That's, I think, the point. And so, again, the point is we should be against all forms of racism, every single form of racism.
Doesn't it dehistoricize Palestinians to not fight on that front now? Does it dehistoricize? Does it not dehistoricize Palestinians? To not call them Semites.
Calling people Semites, these are also European. I mean, these are all European ideas of the 18th and 19th century. Let's focus on people being human beings. Yeah. That's really the more important thing. I'm not really invested in what I want to. It's more understanding people as human beings, as in history, as being historical, as deserving freedom and deserving equality and deserving full human life. End of story. That's really what we should be focusing on. Not pitting victims against victims.
So I know there's somebody in the back row standing up. Yeah, you had your hand up.
I have so many thoughts, but what I'll say, one of the very important points we made is that you can see the way towards peace, right? And so we call on our city council, for example, people in this very room, and they will not pass a ceasefire resolution on a piece of paper unifying that vision. That's part of the hang-up. The other bigger picture hang-up are the machinery. It means the economic machinery that requires the expenditure of munitions, military equipment, new equipment, dropping bombs. All the keep the wealthy people happy with the return on their investment. We shouldn't be allowed to invest in things like war. I mean, what does that give us? More war. It's a machine in this country, and it's precisely that industry that keeps this machine running. And there are people in this room that were silent, purposefully silent about that. We couldn't convince them to say the word ceasefire. In fact, they say it now, but back then that was called anti-Semitic when we said ceasefire. Thank you.
Yeah, so Andy.
My name's Andy. I'm a student in class. I just wanted to touch on your beginning. You spoke on students, the PhD students who are here on student visas or U.S. citizens being basically detained in our country for speaking against things in this country. Certainly, I've never been very rare or never in your lifetime. Is it legal for our government to go and capture and detain?
I mean, it's an excellent question.
Can you repeat the question?
Is it legal for the US government to kidnap and detain? I'm going to tell you that many countries will be kidnapped and detained by ICE authorities. And of course, I'm not a lawyer as such, so you have to ask a lawyer, but I know it's immoral. I know it's absolutely immoral, and I know for a fact, and it certainly strikes me as profoundly unconstitutional based on everything that I've read. But more to the point, understanding they're going after Palestinians now, and Muslims, because they're the low-hanging fruit, such as the official, not the popular. Again, go back to the cue ball. It's the official sort of anti-Palestinian discourse, and the weaponization of anti-Semitism by people who are themselves, I suspect, often certainly like hatred. These people were weaponizing anti-Semitism to crush student protesters, are inevitably going to go after others. Start with the Palestinians. Once you promote the idea of the Constitution, the idea of that First Amendment, you're going to go after others and others. And then you go after, they've gone after citizen card holders, they've gone after these, all who are, as far as I'm aware, again, maybe words in the for more than me, but who have First Amendment rights in this country by virtue of being in this country. These are being eroded. And the question is, what's going to happen next down the line to naturalized citizens and then eventually to foreign citizens and so on and so forth. Not that we should say one is more important than the other, but we know how this plays out.
Yeah.
Unless it's not.
So folks, we are running out of time, so I want to suggest that with the brief amount of time we have left, we just collect a couple of questions and then let Professor Makdisi choose and pick which to respond to. So Jennifer, you have your hand up.
I'm Jennifer. I'm a professor here at SSU, and I was just curious if there was any point in the war where you felt that the Israeli response was not genocide, because I know people felt that genocide would occur before bombs happen, and wondering if there was some point, is there a point where it's like it definitely became this, or it was always going to be that, or is there some way it could have not been, or it just was set to be the horror that it is? And
About the genocide now?
yes.
Well, I'm a historian, so when you talk about the genocide today, I look at it through, obviously you look at it first and foremost in human terms, about the horror of what's happening to actual people on the ground. Then you look at it, as a historian, I look at it through the historical context. What is the relationship between the Gaza genocide and the violent Palestinian humanity in history that goes back all the way to where I began my story, to the Nakba of 1948, to the long history of the persecution of Palestinians, to the shooting of Palestinians. You've seen Palestinian kids being shot. This is not a new story, but the scale is new. The scale is unprecedented, and the visibility. And so too are the protests, by the way. There's global protests. Obviously, around the world, people were horrified by what they have seen. As I said, this is going to scar, first and foremost, the Palestinians, but it's also going to scar those who engage in genocide. It's also going to scar everyone who's watched. So I don't know if there were, the point is, the real question is, what kind of project can one imagine in a multi-religious land that has always been multi-religious? what kind of project, political project, based on the principles of equality, can one imagine, henceforth? And think about the idea, if equality terrifies adherents of a political project, that should tell you something about that political project.
Larry. Yeah, my name's Larry. I'm very close to your position. I find it ironic. I find that ironic that Israel started out as basically an East European project by Eastern European Westernized Jews, and we're pretty much kind of leaning toward the atheistical side, and yet then later followed by Jabotinsky, which you mentioned is one of the precursors to the whole iron wall. I mean, his iron wall theory. Netanyahu has followed that line on. We find ourselves now in this position of continuous warfare based on Jabotinsky's theories. And my question is that, so it's ironic, but now we're coming back where it's starting to become these religious overtones in our political system, where it's being characterized as good versus evil, children of light versus children of darkness. And with the political, the Zionists, the Christian Zionists and the Jewish Zionists, it's starting to feel very, very religious again. And that may be just an excuse for more war, because like what you said, it's not just the Palestinians. This MO of the larger colonial project, I fear that there's a larger game at work here. It's not just Israel, it's the United States, it's France, it's Great Britain, and other regional actors. And they've done this to Egypt, to Lebanon, to Syria, to the Palestinians, and now Iran. And when I see this dehumanization going on so prevalent, and in-your-face dehumanization, which is a major precursor toward genocide, I'm very worried that this is going to happen in Iran. What I'm seeing right now is a ritual of humiliation that we can't do anything about it. And it's part of a strategy to humiliate us again and again. Here, just watching this stuff go down in Gaza, watching all the children being killed.
People are being protested. That's my point. Now they're being crushed. Now there's a chill, obviously, because when the government comes after people, and it does create a chill. And before the government, the institutions themselves, the universities themselves.
And so you say that it's primarily not a religious struggle. But I fear that the language of religion is now being reintegrated as an excuse for more death and destruction.
But I guess I see your point. But what I'm trying to say is that when it was framed in more secular language, there was still violence.
Yeah.
And so the point is, whether it's religious or whether it's secular, the ultimate point is, do accept that people are equal and have history and deserve a place in our human society or not. It's really that simple. That's what it boils down to. You can give it a secular overtone, you can give it a religious overtone, you can give it a nationalist overtone, you can give it a civilizationalist, you can give it any language or discourse that you want, and different languages have been used at different eras. But the truth of the matter is, ultimately, the most important question to ask, other than stopping the genocide, which is the most urgent thing on earth, is, do you fundamentally accept the idea of equality? And if you do, that tells you where you stand.